and welcome to the program Love Unveiled, a journey to resilient relationships. I'm your host, Waqas Malik, and today we have the privilege of welcoming Jon-Paul, an Army veteran, speaker, high performance coach, and lifelong learner. Join us in the first episode as we delve into the driving force behind our need for connection and explore the secrets to lasting love. Thanks for joining, Jon-Paul.
Mohammed, it's so wonderful to see you again. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so very much. So my first question is to you that why do humans crave deep connections and how does it impact the quality of our relationships?
Yeah. And that's such a great question for the times that we're in right now, because I think we've been struggling to engage with each other in meaningful ways since before the pandemic, mostly at work, but also socially and at home. COVID just made it harder because we were isolated for so long, at least us here in the West, and coming back together again, reconnecting with each other hasn't gone very well. And it feels like there's more tension and division these days among people. And the way many of us talk to each other makes it harder to cultivate and keep deep connections. And our environment makes it even more challenging, even for the strongest relationships. And that also affects how we perform at work and the state of our health and mental and emotional well-being. This summer, the US Surgeon General declared we're in an epidemic of loneliness that really started before the pandemic. 52% of Americans report feeling lonely today. In my country, 42% of 18 to 34-year-olds and more adults over the age of 55 say they feel left out of what's going on in society and in their families and in their communities. 58% of Americans often feel like no one in their life really knows them very well. And so if we can just break this down into the most simple parts, everyone's probably heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at least the most basic needs. Let me show you. Yeah, look at where love and belonging are on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And we read this from the bottom up. We have basic physiological needs of food, water, clothing, shelter, and sleep. And then we have a need for safety. Immediately after that, we have a need for love and belonging. That comes right after our basic needs. And that's how important relationships are to the human conditions. We're wired for connection to each other, and we're struggling with that today.
Right. So can you identify the single most crucial factor for creating and sustaining healthy relationships?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say maybe it's a combination of a few things. I believe the number one thing you need to begin to create a great relationship, and it's so simple because our minds can get so cluttered with thoughts every day, we tend to forget, is self-awareness. And what I mean by that, more specifically, is awareness of our needs, just like we saw on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and honoring them. Because it's when you don't fulfill your most basic need for connection, intimacy, and belonging that life begins to feel out of balance. And that's when we have to start dealing with feelings of being on guard about what people's motives are. So if you want to create and sustain healthy relationships, I suggest you ask yourself this question: do I understand my needs? And am I honoring them? Because we have a personal responsibility to honor our needs. And if you don't understand and honor your relationship needs, it can be more challenging to create and sustain a healthy one. And I would also add empathy and self-compassion to this too, because we tend to judge ourselves way too much, and that cuts us off from growth opportunities, including in our relationships. So my recommendation is try to replace your judgment and self-criticism with more empathy and self-compassion, just as you would for anyone else. And once you have awareness and you give yourself grace, especially when things get challenging, as they sometimes will, you can figure out the rest, especially when you're with someone that's on the same page as you, where meeting your needs is concerned.
Right. In what ways does generational trauma influence the choices and success of our relationships?
Yeah, I love this because so few people think about this. And I spend a lot of time thinking about this, and I'll tell you why in just a minute. Because trauma is a difficult topic for some people to talk about because of the misplaced emotion of shame that many attach to it. But it really needs to come into the light, this discussion about trauma. So let's understand what generational trauma is. Generational trauma is the passing down of the psychological impact of a traumatic experience from one generation to the next. If one generation experiences trauma and they don't do the work of healing that wound that occurs, then they tend to pass that wound to the generations that follow. I call it the first wound we ever experience after we're born. And I believe all of us experience it. I believe it's very, very common. It's in all of us. And that's why we need to understand that generational trauma influences the mental well-being of families across generations. And that influences how safe you felt to laugh and play and be a carefree kid when you were a child, whether you felt seen and heard by your parents when you were young, the narrative you developed about yourself that later became your identity, your ability to learn and grow as you grow up, your parenting style, how you interact with others, and of course, who you get into relationships with. Here's why I believe it's such an important topic to talk about more. My parents were children in World War II. My father grew up in Holland and my mother grew up in Indonesia. Since there was no treatment for trauma until 1980, I was the recipient of a lot of generational trauma from my parents that they suffered at the hands of the Germans and the Japanese that they were exposed to when they were 8, 9, 10 years old. So that the way it was expressed to me influenced the choices I made about the people I felt comfortable getting into relationships with. And interestingly, it was always with someone who was a vibrational match mentally and emotionally, which is where all trauma finds expression. But remember, people don't behave this way because they're bad people. My parents were wonderful people. They were just wounded because they experienced trauma that they didn't heal. They weren't even aware that they had been traumatized because it just wasn't spoken about. So they do it because they were taught it, and they adopted these behaviors in order to survive whatever was happening in their environment at that time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, how does healing old emotional wounds play a vital role in achieving the relationships of our dreams?
Yeah. I think all of us have limiting beliefs, and many were unknowingly given to us by our parents. That's that generational trauma manifesting itself. And that's how it gets passed from one generation to another. Through it manifests in limiting beliefs. And we create other limiting beliefs as we live our life. If we grew up in a home where abuse or neglect or dysfunction existed, we certainly were wounded emotionally from those experiences. So, in order to create the conditions for having strong, vibrant, loving relationships where we feel seen and heard and supported and respected, we owe it to ourselves to do the work of healing those wounds. Think about this. Would you really rush headlong into a relationship with someone if you could see all the emotional baggage they were carrying, if you could see their wounds that they haven't healed? You'd probably think twice before jumping in. And a little bit of self-care with less judgment and self-criticism and a lot more self-compassion and empathy can go a long way to creating the conditions for attracting someone into our lives that is aligned with the best of who we are.
Right. So, what are the 4 essential secrets to fostering and maintaining great relationships?
Yeah, I love this question. And it's something that I teach to my audience as well. So these are 4 questions that you can easily ask and apply to any relationship that you're in, whether it's a personal relationship, one at home, with family or with friends, or a professional relationship at work. And these questions will give you answers that are indicators of the health of that relationship. So the first question is, do I feel understood? Do I feel like the person I'm in relationship with understands me? Number 2 is, do I feel valued? Does that person value who I am and what I bring into this relationship? My talents, my skills, my personality, my sense of humor. Do I feel valued by that person for who I am? Number 3 is, do I feel respected? Does that person respect me for who I am? Or do they judge me? And do they criticize me? And finally, the last question is, do I feel appreciated? Does that other person appreciate what I bring into this relationship? Do they appreciate me for making it richer, happier, better, more fulfilling? Do they see me as a contributor to a more fulfilling and happy life for them? And I believe if we can answer yes to all 4 questions, do I feel understood? Do I feel valued? Do I feel respected? And do I feel appreciated? Then we're in a pretty healthy relationship that is worth keeping and nurturing and building. But if we answer no to any one or more of those questions, or we have questions, then that opens the door for a conversation to try to cultivate feeling more understood or feeling more valued by the other person, or gaining more respect or appreciation for who we are and what we offer. That opens the door for those conversations to have to take place and mend those parts that are so essential to having a healthy, vibrant relationship. And then you can make a decision as you work through that. Is this relationship one that I want to continue working on and continue building on and having as part of my life going into the future? Or has it run its course? Have we done all we could and achieved all we can together, and this is the limit, and maybe I need to consider a different path? I think these 4 questions can really help guide our lives to creating great relationships, whether it's at home, with our friends, in our social circle, or in our careers. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us for this first episode of What Drives Our Need for Connection. Remember, understanding the power of connection is the first step towards lasting love. Stay tuned for our next episode where we uncover more secrets to thriving relationships. Thanks, Jon-Paul.
Thank you, Mama. Great to see you.